Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening for our chat with two rabbis, Rabbi Zvi Kahn and Rabbi Barry Silver. We're very thankful to have you guys here and grateful that you took the time to be with us. And looking forward to a nice discussion with Rabbi Kahn and Rabbi Barry Silver. So with that, take it away, gentlemen.
Sharon, thank you very much for coordinating this and for organizing the Zoom. And thank you everyone for joining us. And Rabbi Kahn, always a pleasure to see you once again. Well, we have a really fascinating Torah passage. And I think we should start out as we usually do, discussing the Torah passage, and then we can talk about what's going on in the world today and maybe what one has to do with the other. The passage for this week.
Sure. Happy to start out at least from the beginning of the Torah passage. So the Torah portion of the week is called Va-Yishlach, and in the beginning of the passage, it deals with the patriarch Jacob and his family returning home to the land of Israel, or at that time it was called the land of Canaan. And he had been away for a very long time. The Torah tells us he had been away for 20 years. And he's coming back, and he gets a message that his brother Esau is coming towards him with 400 men. And that's a very frightening message, because if Esau was coming in friendship and in peace, he would not have needed an army of 400 men with him. He would have needed a few attendants and a few friends, colleagues to travel, a few traveling buddies. But the fact that he's coming with 400 men means that Jacob felt like he was possibly, or maybe even likely, probably coming to wipe out Jacob and his family. So it's very fascinating to me, and I want to share it with you, what Jacob does at that point. He does three things, the Torah tells us. The first thing he does is he divides his camp into Shnei Machanot, which means two camps. He divides up his whole group of people that are with him, his wives, his children, his servants, his flocks. He divides everybody up into two camps, and he splits them up. He puts distance between them. And the reason he does that is because he says, if Esau is coming to attack us, we have very little chance of defending ourselves. He has 400 armed men, and I have my family, my children, my servants. I don't have an army with me. So he says, at least if Esau comes and attacks one of the groups, the other group will be able to escape. So it's a very practical kind of plan. And if the worst comes to worst, if the worst happens, then the Torah tells us the second thing Jacob does is he prays to God, and he says, please save me from my brother who's coming, it looks like is coming to attack us, and please save us from that and protect us. And then the third thing he does is he gets together, he assembles a tremendous amount of animals, different kinds of animals, to send as a gift ahead of him, down the road ahead of him, to Esau. And he tells his servants who go with the animals to say to Esau, this is all from your brother Jacob, who wishes you well, and he considers himself your servant, and he wants to honor you with this gift. And in the end, we know that Esau comes and thankfully does not attack Jacob, and the two brothers make peace and are able to, the story is able to proceed without a war and without violence. I really think there's a wonderful lesson here for each and every one of us in our own lives when we come, if we have a calamity, if we have a possible true calamity facing us, or some real serious problem facing us, and Jacob was faced with possible death and destruction of his whole family. The first step is to do everything practically that we can, if in fact worse comes to worse. Imagine a hurricane is coming, and we live in a place where that's pretty common. So the first thing you do is don't waste any time. Make all practical arrangements that you possibly can. Then the second thing that Jacob does, he says, don't forget about God, pray and put energy into the power of prayer. And then the third thing is try and avoid the calamity altogether. In Jacob's situation, that meant sending gifts to Esau and appeasing him, which ultimately was successful. And so in the hurricane example, maybe a person would make all the preparations around their house, bring in the plants, lock up the windows, put up the boards, do everything you do. And then if you can jump in your car and get away in time and completely avoid the problem of the hurricane, that's what Jacob did with his sending of the gifts. He tried to completely avoid the whole problem. And again, he was successful, thankfully. So it's just, it's nice, I think, that the Parsha kind of starts off with this three-step process as to what we can still do thousands of years later when we're faced with any kind of serious situation like Jacob was.
Very nice. I appreciate the wonderful background that you gave about the Torah passage. I just want to share a little bit about the Hebrew, because I love the Hebrew language, and I like to be able to relate it to people in a way they might be able to be familiar with. And on Purim, they say Shalach Manas. And there's a Purim song, Shalach Manas, give and take, eat your hamantash and cake. So Shalach means to send. Manos is a gift. It's related to the word Natan, like Natan Lanu, he gave us. So Shalach means to give. So Va-Yishlach, or to send rather, and Va-Yishlach means and he sent. We also have a word for somebody in America who's an ambassador to Israel. They're called a shaliach. A shaliach is someone who helps send people to Israel. So that's where this word Va-Yishlach comes from. Jacob sent out people to Esau. What I think is fascinating about the passage, there's actually two encounters that Jacob has with God in this passage. And I'm very interested in encounters with God in the Torah and how we might be able to have similar encounters today, even though we might be a little more scientifically sophisticated and approach things from a rational approach. We may be able to discover an encounter with the divine. So how does that happen? On two different occasions, how is it that he encounters the divine? On the first one, it's in a dream. So a lot of times when we are in a different state of consciousness, it allows us to have an encounter with a sacred or holy part within us and within the world. So he's in an altered state. He's having a dream. And he dreams that he's wrestling with a divine being. And he's not really sure of the identity of this being, but he's wrestling in his dream. According to primitive people, these spirits always had to disappear by dawn. When it was dawn and light out, they had to go. Like Cinderella at midnight, they had to disappear because dawn was somehow anathema to them. They only hung out at night. So it's almost dawn, and this being that he's wrestling with says, I'm out of here, I gotta go. And Jacob says, no, no, no. You cannot go until you give me a blessing. What does that mean, my friends? That means that for Jewish people, we seek to be a blessing. And we will not let go of this encounter unless we're blessed. So to have an encounter with the divine within us means we have a desire to be a blessing to others. And if we can be a blessing to other people, then Jacob is said to have prevailed. He saw God and he prevailed. How? By wanting to be a blessing and wanting to help other people. By helping other people and being a blessing to others, he encounters God. Now, how else does he encounter God? Now, shortly after that, by the way, before that happened, to get to that spot, he crosses a river called the Jabbok River. Ancient peoples, when they had some transformation in their life, they would cross a river. Like Julius Caesar, he crossed the Rubicon, and then his status changed. He became the emperor. Once he crossed the Rubicon, he came in with his armies, and his status changed. So this indicates that Jacob's status changed, and he got a new name, Yisrael, someone who struggles with God. Yisrael is the classic translation, struggles with God, but it means something else. Yisra, meaning struggle, could also mean Yashar. The letters are the same. Yashar El means he's straight with God. Jacob was a deceiver. He deceived his father and his brother to cheat them out of the blessing. He deceived his father-in-law Laban to get extra animals. He was deceptive. But this time, Yashar El, when he became straight and honest and true, he encountered the divine within himself. He crossed the Rubicon, so to speak, and he had a new version of himself and an encounter with God. And what did he do? What's the first thing he did? Now, Rabbi Kahn rightly says he took all these very practical measures in order to try to survive. I look at it a little bit differently. Yes, he did all those things, and that's important. But when he changed, when he was a new person, when he was no longer Jacob, but Yisrael, it means he's straight with God. All of a sudden, he approaches Jacob. There's no more deception. He confronts him head on. He goes right to the front of the line, and he says, and he confronts God by confronting his brother Esau.
Please mute yourself if you're causing that. Muting everybody, just.
That's another way that he confronts God. He hears echoes of his past, echoes of his ancestors, and that voice within him that's echoing in him, it causes him to be straight with his brother, to realize this is my brother. I cheated him. And so he's giving him gifts to show him, I understand that I treated you wrong, and now I want to treat you right. And at that point, the Torah says something fascinating. He says to his brother, take my gifts, because seeing you is like seeing the face of God. What that means to me is that when we reconcile with our brothers, and all humanity is brothers, and when we take someone who used to be an adversary and we befriend them, God appears, holiness appears, and that is what we need today more than ever. We're at odds with our brothers in the United States and with fellow Jews. How does God appear? God appears when we create an atmosphere of reconciliation and of unity, and then we can work together for a good cause. That's what I see that's fascinating about this passage. There's many other things in it that are very interesting, but these two encounters with God, you can see a rational way of bringing God into your life by struggling, by questioning, by asking, not by accepting God. By the way, one other thing. Jacob is wrestling with this divine figure, and he says, tell me your name, tell me your name. Well, he knew God's name, or he should have, because his grandfather Abraham had a name for God, El Shaddai. El was a name for God. Shaddai has a different type of meaning, but it means the one who's sufficient. El Shaddai. All of a sudden, he doesn't know God's name anymore. What does that mean? It means he has to chart his own course. He can't just accept what he was told. You know, if you were just told, okay, this is what God's all about. He did this and that, and he's in the Torah, and you would read this. You don't believe in God. That's indoctrination. That's brainwashing. To believe in God, really, you have to have your own encounter, your own understanding. That's why he doesn't know the name. He's searching on his own. He's wrestling. And when you stop believing because of dogma and because people told you, and you start looking for yourself and you stand on their shoulders, you take what they've taught you, but you find your own path and your own understanding, then you can find God. That's what this passage says, I believe, to all Jewish people, especially today, who are searching to bring God into their life. I'd be interested in hearing from others about this topic, and then I want to talk about what's going on in Israel, especially the assassination of the Iranian nuclear guy, and I also want to talk about the new person who is recommended for Secretary of State who's Jewish. His name is Blinken, Tony Blinken. And then I want to discuss with Rabbi Kahn something that I heard Jonathan Katz, the famous Orthodox rabbi, say that I found very troubling, something that I don't accept as valid, that I want to discuss with Rabbi Kahn to get his take on it. Is there anyone here who would like to discuss the Torah reading, who has any comments about what we discussed in the Torah reading?
And you can raise your Zoom hand if you'd like to speak.
If not, let's move on to Israel. Rabbi Kahn, tell me what you think about Tony Blinken. I notice a lot of people on the right-wing Jews are trashing him, saying that he's no good. He's the stepson of a Holocaust survivor, someone who's been committed to Israel and Judaism his whole life. He would be a Jewish Secretary of State, which would be, to me, a phenomenal thing. And yet you have Jewish people saying terrible things about him and how we shouldn't accept him because he's not right-wing enough. He's not Trumpian enough. And I think this is very dangerous when Jewish people turn on each other, especially when we can have someone Jewish as Secretary of the State, a great friend of Israel. That's my opinion. I think he'd be fantastic. I was wondering what you think about Tony Blinken.
Well, look, I think that it's hard to know. It's really truly impossible to know now what policies he's going to advocate for. So we can look at his background, we can look at his history, we can look at his personal history and his professional history, but it's really impossible to know what mandate he's going to be given by President-elect Biden, and it's impossible to say for sure what he's going to do. So I think there's a tremendous amount of speculation out there. One of the concerns that I think people have is that he was an important figure in the Obama administration, and there were a lot of concerns then at the time, even though there's no doubt that Israel received a tremendous amount of support during the Obama presidency. There also was tremendous pressure put on Israel to do things to make sacrifices that they weren't prepared to make, that they didn't think necessarily were in the best interest of Israel, in order to make peace with the Palestinians and move in the direction of a two-state kind of solution under terms that I think the Israeli government at that time certainly didn't feel was in its best interest. So people are concerned, is Blinken going to come in and kind of reinstate all of that and bring all of that back, that pressure on Israel, which is viewed as unfortunate based on the fact that now we see some Arab countries moving in a different direction and making peace with Israel without insisting that they give up withdraw from the West Bank and the Golan Heights, et cetera, and things like that. So there's concern, but I agree with you 100% that it's way too early for people to do any bashing or throw him under the bus, so to speak, when we have no idea what policies he's going to embrace. We have no idea what he's going to say and what he's going to do. And we have no idea really the whole Biden administration. We don't know what is their position going to be. I think President-elect Biden, to his tremendous credit, when you hear him talk now, what is he talking about? He's talking about the coronavirus, and he's talking about the economy and stimulus. He's talking about the things that are really the lifeblood of what we need in this country right now. He's not saying what my foreign policy is going to be, even though he's putting his people in place, and those things are important. So I think, to his credit, to Biden's credit, we really don't know, because his foreign policy is not nearly as important as his domestic policy. We're in the middle of a crisis of the coronavirus, and he has to take steps to start saving people's lives, which he's anxious to do. So I agree with you 100%, Rabbi, that it's way too early to draw any conclusions, certainly negative conclusions, about a man who, as you say, is very committed to Israel, is the child of Holocaust survivors, is tremendously knowledgeable and has tremendous experience. Why not say, let's give this guy a chance? If you're not going to embrace him and support him, at least let's say, let's give him a chance.
Hey, Rabbi Kahn, I'm glad we're in agreement on this one, but you are so polite. And you have such a positive, wonderful view of others. I don't have a positive, wonderful view about the people who are going after Blinken. You say we should give him a chance, and you would, but there are people who have already decided that Joe Biden is going to fail. And they've already decided they're going to do everything they can to make him fail, just like they did with Obama. These are right-wing extremist Jews who sabotaged and attacked Obama and made sure before he even got into office that he would be destroyed personally and politically. And I find that repulsive and abhorrent, especially among the Jewish people. And I find the same thing happening now, and I'm disgusted with them. And I do not have polite things to say about them. I do not have polite things to say about them who would take someone who's Jewish, the stepson of a Holocaust survivor, who's committed himself to Israel, and start trashing him. That's wrong. I know it's wrong because they've done the same to me. I've gone on stage where these people, these thugs, these right-wing extremists have booed me off the stage, have jeered me, have said horrible things about me, even saying that it's too bad that I wasn't born during the 40s, so I could have been tossed into an oven because my view of Israel isn't identical to theirs. These are people who are haters, and we need to stand up to them because they are harmful, very harmful to Israel. As far as Obama is concerned, I look at it a little bit differently. I've read Obama's memoirs. I've seen what he has to say about Israel. and I'm not one of these knee-jerk people on the left, I don't think really positive stuff about Obama when it comes to Israel. I hear him saying things about Israel that are rather negative, that they were usurpers, that they started wars, that they were aggressive. I don't see in his memoirs where he's saying that Israel only fought to defend herself, that Israel is the only bastion of freedom in the Middle East, that Israel has done all it could to seek peace. I don't see it, but I don't see him like the right wing do, saying he's totally anti-Israel. He's not. He's kind of somewhere in the middle. But the liberals make him out to be very pro-Israel, and the right wing make him out to be very anti. It's not true. He's somewhere in between. But I would say this: if Tony Blinken was involved with Obama's administration, then maybe that's why Obama did so many great things for Israel, because despite what he said in his memoirs, as Rabbi Kahn said, he was very friendly to Israel. He helped build up their defenses, and he stood with Israel, and he was a friend of Israel. So I think it's wrong for these people to be trashing Blinken. And I think that the Jewish community needs to do what they can to stand together. I'm all for joining together as one with the Jewish community, but these people have to be told in no uncertain terms, you are no friend of Israel. If you are going to suggest that Tony Blinken shouldn't be Secretary of State, then you are not helping Israel. I'd love to hear what others have to say about this topic. Anybody else? Emily, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe Emily's hand is, yeah.
First of all, it bothers me to have Jews represented as a uniform bloc. Jews have various opinions. That's just as bad as saying that all the people who voted for Trump because they were all rich and they had money in the stock market. People voted for Trump for different reasons, and Jews will support people for different reasons. As far as Blinken is concerned and Biden, I agree with Rabbi Kahn. There are so many issues besides Israel to consider: the environment, the virus, our economy. Israel is one of many things. I don't think there should be aspersions cast on anyone for one reason. We have divergent views. That's what's good about people.
We do have divergent views, but the right-wing Jews have virtually one view and one issue, and that's Israel. That's why I talked about Israel. Of course, he would be great on the other issues, no doubt about it. But
Right.
even when it comes to Israel, they're wrong. They're wrong to attack him and to suggest that he would not be good for Israel. He would be very good for Israel. And if he's not extreme enough for them, then we're in trouble. If somebody like this would invoke their ire and their castigation, we're in trouble. They're extremists. And anybody else want to talk about this? Because there's something else I want to talk about with Rabbi Kahn that's kind of that I'm also very anxious to get his opinion on.
You can
Okay.
unmute yourselves, whoever would like to.
Go ahead, Harris.
Unmute yourself, Harris. Unmute yourself, Harris. Harris, unmute yourself.
Okay, can you
Okay.
hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. On the scientist in Iran that got murdered, I felt it was a terrorist attack. And there was no need for Israel to do that. It would only cause more conflict. And as far as God is concerned, where was God when all these millions of Jews have passed away? And if it wasn't for the Inquisition and the Holocaust, there'd be 50 million more Jews. Where was God?
Well, Harris, you raise a very good point. That's why I don't believe that there's some entity out there watching over us or protecting us. If there is such an entity, that entity is doing a horrible, miserable job and is asleep at the switch. If there is such an entity that has all power and is watching over us, and either that entity is blind, impotent, or uncaring and unfeeling, one or the other. If God could have stopped the Holocaust and didn't, then God must care nothing about the Jewish people, as well as a whole bunch of other tragedies. That's just one example. If he couldn't do anything about it, then he's impotent. Either way, the traditional view of God makes absolutely no sense. And that's why so many Jewish people have been turned off to Judaism, because the concept as originally conceived in the Torah is irrational. And it might have made sense to people in a pre-scientific age, or when people were just believing what they were told. It makes no sense today. That's why the only concept of a God that makes any sense is one that jives with science. It's to believe that there is a creative power in this universe, and it's also within us, but there's no power that's guiding us or guiding the universe. The only morality that's going to be interjected into the system comes from us, and maybe from Judaism and other religions and other philosophies and other people. But the concept that there's a God watching over us, I say, went up in ashes in the chimneys of Auschwitz and was buried with the bodies of the Jews of Va-Dor. That concept is no longer relevant. And Rabbi Kahn, I'm sure you might have a different opinion on that. So I welcome you to share your point of view on that.
Thank you. I do have a very different opinion. I would say really two things. One is I do not believe that there is any possibility of a meaningful Judaism without God, without a belief in God. I think that God is central and axiomatic to Judaism, to certainly to traditional Judaism, to the Judaism that's observed by Jews for millennia. And in terms of there is no doubt that the tragedies that happened, and we've mentioned the Holocaust, and Harris mentioned the Inquisition, and throughout Jewish history, tragically there have been so many terrible cataclysmic events, and not just for the Jewish people. If we look at the world history, we can see terrible, terrible events and suffering that have been in the world. But just relating to Judaism, I would really kind of turn the argument around and say the following. I believe the case can definitely be made that without God, Jews would no longer be around. So we can look at it and we can say, how is it that God allowed these things to happen, where throughout the thousands of years that the Jewish people have been on the earth, while other nations have started and risen and then collapsed and are no longer exist in the world in any kind of real or meaningful sense. Many thinkers and writers, and including the famous statement by Mark Twain, have said, if it wasn't for God, how could the Jews even still be here? And so certainly there are tremendously profound, difficult questions and answers about suffering in the world and suffering of the Jewish people. But I do not believe, and I do not agree for 1 second, that those things disprove God. They have to be dealt with with sensitivity. They have to be dealt with. And in the end, in the final analysis, things happen in life that we don't understand and we don't have answers for. And a person's own life, let's put aside national issues and Jewish issues of millions. In a person's own life, God forbid, they can suffer a terrible tragedy, the loss of a child. No one can give them an answer as to why that happened. No one can say, oh, here's the explanation as to why this innocent baby or innocent child died. That it is a fact of life that terrible, sad, tragic things do happen.
Rabbi Kahn, we do have an answer. The Orthodox have no answer because it doesn't make sense to them. If you have a good God and bad things are happening, they have no answer. But rational people have an answer. The answer is that things happen at random in the universe. There's no guiding spirit or person. That we have an answer. It's just the Orthodox don't like the answer, and so they say, well, we have none. Also, as far as God is concerned, you're saying that you can't have Judaism that's meaningful without a concept of God, but the concept of God has changed radically from the beginning. In the beginning of Judaism, they thought that God was a terrible ogre and they had to make sacrifices, otherwise he would slaughter you. They thought that if you didn't obey the Sabbath, God would execute you. They thought if you were worshiping the wrong God, God was ordering extermination of entire peoples. The concept of God has always changed. And that's why with science, the concept can change even further because it gives us greater revelations. It's not either there's a God or there's not a God. The question is, are we in this century armed with the knowledge of science and reason? Are we going to allow God to continue to change as God has changed throughout Jewish history? Or are we going to continue to cling to an archaic form of God that people can't believe anymore unless they're indoctrinated? to say that, well, God is a mystery and we don't have an answer, it's not satisfying. And to me, it's a cop-out. And also, as far as Mark Twain is concerned, as far as I know from Mark Twain, I've read his quote many times, his question was not answered. He asked, how can we explain the Jews' immortality? He left it as a rhetorical question. Well, there's a lot better answers than to say that God's watching over us, because like I say, if he's watching over us, he's not doing a very good job. How can we explain the Jews' immortality? Traditions. We pass things on from parents to children. We cling to knowledge. We have an indomitable spirit. We have a mission and a purpose, and it's an eternal purpose. We have a people that has demonstrated qualities that others lack. We've been spread all over the world, so that if there's a cataclysm in one place, the rest of us still survive. So even if we're wiped out one place, we survive somewhere else. We're not located in one spot, so that if an aggressor comes in, we're all wiped out. I mean, there's a lot of explanations for why we're still here that make a lot more sense without having to resort to the supernatural. So I'm also curious, Rabbi Kahn, if you think that someone like me, I don't have I don't believe in a personal God. Do you think that therefore I am not capable of having a life of meaning because my view is different and I don't believe in a personal God? Or is it possible for people to think that way, or even to be Jewish and have no belief in God at all? Could you be a Jewish atheist who believes in Jewish ideals and still derive just as much meaning as the next guy? Or do you think you need to have this concept of a personal God to have meaning as a Jew?
So I never speak about I'm not a kind of person who ever evaluates other people's individuals' beliefs, philosophies, life choices. So I would never make a comment about Rabbi Silver, about yourself. I have the utmost respect and admiration for what you do and everything. So that's not a question, that's not something I would ever even think about. In order to explain the comment that I made, it wasn't that people can't have a life of meaning without God. I think there are people around across the planet can have all kinds of different types of lives full of meaning and full of joy and full of all kinds of important and wonderful things without having any belief in God, or having a belief in God that's radically different from my belief in God, or from what I think Judaism's belief in God might be. So yes, I definitely think people can have lives of meaning. The statement that I made was that Judaism as a religion, Judaism as a religion in its traditional sense. Now, a person can stand up tomorrow and say, well, I want to take the word Judaism, give it my own definition, and they can make up whatever they want. And I have no way to comment on that because it's a new innovation. But Judaism in its traditional form that's been in this world, and I believe has brought blessings, as you mentioned earlier, to this world for thousands of years, I don't believe that Judaism can stand without a belief in God. If you take God out of the equation, then you might want to call it humanism. You might want to call it lots of things. You might want to call it ethical. You might want to call it science. You might want to call it rationalism. But I don't think you can call it anything that's connected to traditional Judaism if you take God completely out of the equation. And I am not suggesting that's what you're saying or doing. I'm just making that statement as an independent state.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion, because in my understanding of it, as my father taught me, as I learned from Jewish history, the concept of God, like I said, is radically changed. Our concept of God today is very, very, very different than the concept back in the Bible, where they thought God was ordering murder and genocide and all types of things. We see God as more of a loving spirit, and not just a God of the Jewish people, not a tribal God, but a cosmic God who permeates everything and doesn't have a special relationship with any one group of people. But it is a very interesting discussion. I'm going to push you a little bit, though. You said you wouldn't comment on someone else's belief in God. If somebody else, like let's say a Muslim terrorist, believed that God ordered them to kill people who are not Muslim and to attack Israel, would you have something to say about their belief in God? Or would you say, hey, you know what? I can't really comment on their belief in God. It's all good.
Well, I guess I'm like everybody else, that if you push me into a corner, if you give me an extreme example, then that makes it a little bit different. Obviously, every with every fiber of my being, I oppose people who say it's our job to kill Jews and attack Israel because it's our religion. That to me is a meaningless justification and a meaningless term. I can't stand aside and say, oh, it's your religion. Well, I respect that that's your belief system. You know,
Well, that's good. I'm relieved about that. You probably wouldn't care for someone who's Christian who says, well, the Jews rejected Jesus and killed him. Therefore, my understanding is that God wants me to kill Jews. I suppose you probably wouldn't care for that concept of God either.
I can't, again, I can't, as much as I want to be open-minded and tolerant of other people's ideas, and you and I touched upon this, I think, a couple of discussions back. I can't be open-minded to people who want to kill Jews and want to attack us, and whatever their justification might be. I'm going to view it as misguided and unacceptable. The point that I did make a couple of conversations ago was, if they don't add the point about attacking Jews and they say, this is my belief system. Let's say a Christian person, as you say, says, when I read my scripture, I think it's clear that the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus, who I view as my personal savior and God, or whatever they might say. And therefore, I personally, I have a problem with Jews because of that. I actually don't have a problem with that. I think that falls under the category of freedom of belief. If that's what you believe, you can believe that, but don't commit violence and don't advocate violence. So do stretch it, but I don't stretch it to the point of violence or instance of violence.
Rabbi Kahn, I just wanted to talk to you about another interesting topic. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Now, he is the Orthodox icon, and we discussed him a while back, and I had positive things to say about him. I had some things that weren't so positive that I decided not to share because he had just passed away. I didn't want to introduce negativity into I guess, a celebration of his life. But I have listened to his speeches, and there's a lot of it. I happen to think that he's a brilliant speaker. He's got that great British accent. So when he starts to talk, you think, this guy's smart, and he's eloquent, and he was made a lord or a knight or whatever, and he's the chief rabbi. When he speaks, he just seems like he really knows what he's talking about. But as I listen to it and think through it, some of it seems a little bit shaky or a little bit scary. Now, I watched him, and I encourage you to watch a debate between Jonathan Sacks and one of my heroes, Richard Dawkins. And Rabbi Sacks is defending the Jewish belief in God. And Richard Dawkins is saying, but you don't believe that the Torah is true, do you? And he said, the belief that the Torah can be taken as literally true is heresy. And I was shocked by that. I thought, this is a cardinal belief of the Orthodox that it's literally true. And then he said it's heresy. And then he started disparaging Dawkins, saying, oh, pretty much like, you poor simpleton, don't you know that Jewish people have the oral law? We don't take the Torah literally true. It's supplemented by the oral law. And therefore, these things in the Torah that seem like they're not very kind or kind of harsh, you just don't get it. There's an oral law to it. And to me, first of all, I found him extremely condescending to Richard Dawkins, who is a brilliant, brilliant scientist. But also, I thought his explanation defies logic. Just for the people here who are listening, so you can understand, if you're not familiar with the oral law, it's a basic principle of Orthodox Judaism, is that there's things in the Torah that seem very harsh and barbaric. In fact, they are. There's genocide against 7 different groups of people. And I found it interesting that Rabbi Kahn was saying, we Jews, we don't believe in genocide. This is the main, we don't believe in killing children. But in these episodes of genocide, the children of 7 nations were all wiped out, as were all the children in the flood with Noah's Ark. And what he's attempting to defend that by saying, oh, you don't understand, there's an oral law. I'm at a loss to understand how the oral law could possibly circumvent the clear reading of the Torah, which says that there was genocide and the murder of children. And that's why I don't take it literally. But he says, well, we don't take it literally, it's heresy. But on the other hand, there's the oral law. And then Richard Dawkins said, all right, if you don't take it literally, he said, what about the parting of the Red Sea? He said, oh, well, that's true. That's true. So Dawkins says, what about Adam and Eve? He says, well, that's not true. So he says, well, how do you know which bits are true and which bits aren't true? So he said, don't you know that in Judaism in the 10th century, they said that if there's an idea that's incompatible with science, therefore we don't take that literally, which is ridiculous because there was no science in the 10th century and science is always learning more and more. So that would mean that what's literally true is constantly shifting depending on how science emerges. And to say that if there was something that contradicted the genocide in the Torah, why would God put it in there? Why would he put in writing that you should kill people who don't believe the way you do and kill people who don't follow the Sabbath? Why would he put that in writing and then hope that the oral law, which wasn't even written until maybe 1,000 years later, would be followed by somebody and then they would get it straight? It doesn't make any rational sense to me. And I know it's a tough question, but that's kind of like what we do here. We ask the tough questions, but I'm kind of curious, Rabbi Kahn. First of all, do you agree that to take the Torah literally is heresy? And secondly, do you accept that there's an oral law? And if there is an oral law, why did it take so long to get codified? And how does that in any way offset the genocide and the murder that's in the Torah? And why not just be straight and say that this isn't right? Why would it? Can you explain that for me? Because to me, I found it very troubling.
Listen, I didn't hear the debate that you're referring to between Rabbi Jonathan Sachs and Richard Dawkins. I'd love to hear it. Sounds pretty interesting and pretty fiery, but I didn't hear it, so I can't comment on anything specific because I didn't hear it. I can say this: I think the fundamental point, it seems to me, that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, may rest in peace, was trying to convey was that in Orthodox Judaism we have a combination of two things as our central text, as our core text, and that is the Torah itself, which anyone can pick up and read, the 5 books of Moses, and that is what we call and then the second thing is called the oral law or the oral tradition, which we call it oral because our belief is, the Orthodox belief is that it was transmitted from God to Moses at the time that God gave Moses the written law, the Torah, and it was passed down for generations that way in an oral form, in an oral explanation, until it was written down many years later. And is
how many years later, and in how many different forms was it written?
So the different pieces of the oral law were written down at different times, sometimes just for people to remember. They felt like, oh, they couldn't remember it and they didn't want it to be lost and they wrote it down. But the actual systematic process of writing it down, we can put that in the time of the Mishnah, which is the 2nd century, around the year 100, 150 CE of the Common Era, so less than 2,000 years ago. And that, of course, is 1,000 years after the time of Moses, approximately. So you're talking about about 1,000 years without the oral law written down systematically in a systematic form. Then it's getting written down, but only partially, and then more of it is written down in terms of the Talmud, which is a few hundred years later. So at this point, if a person said, I want to study the Torah, fine, read the 5 books of Moses. And I want to study the oral law, so the answer would be, we'll study the Talmud, study the Mishnah, the Talmud.
Rabbi Kahn.
Yes.
You acknowledge there's 2 different Talmuds, right? Babylonian,
Palestinian
Jerusalem
Talmud.
Talmud.
Yes.
And you also acknowledge that in the Talmud, there's about 8 different opinions for every question, right? So how does that clarify anything? How does that clarify that you shouldn't commit genocide, that you shouldn't sacrifice children, that you shouldn't execute people on the Sabbath? And if God only spoke to the Jewish people through the Torah, why wasn't he a little more clear? Why would he do something so ridiculous as to put things in there that are completely barbaric, and then wait around for 1,000 years for some people to get around to writing things to try to clarify it, which are completely contradictory, and which very often don't clarify some of the more hideous things in the Torah? And then how does he say that certain parts of the Torah are literal and certain parts aren't? It's just a mass of confusion. And the confusion then gets spread to Christians and Muslims who go around wiping people out too. And if God had foreknowledge, didn't he foresee all this? Didn't he realize that if he was not clear that this would generate all types of violence? I mean, to me, the whole concept is just one insanity after another, compounding it more and more and more. It doesn't add to the clarification at all. It just makes it a morass. To me, it's much simpler just to say the Torah was written as our first attempt at morality, not our last. The Torah was written as our first attempt to understand God, not our last. The Torah represents the beginning of the ethical approach of Jews, not our final one. And therefore, it wasn't written by God. It's written by human beings trying to understand God. Doesn't that make more sense?
So let me, again, I feel like you've added many important questions to the original questions you asked me. I'm just trying to deal with the subject on a basic level. I would say this, you and I both know, based on our previous conversations and the discussions that we've had, that we approach the Torah and we approach certainly the Talmud in very, very different ways. You might almost say diametrically opposed ways, although we appreciate many of the similar things and we're able, thankfully, to be able to share, discussions about it. But it's no surprise, shouldn't be a surprise to you, and it's no surprise to me, nor should it be a surprise to the participants, that you and I approach these issues in very, very different ways. You look at the Torah as an early iteration and barbaric in many of its ways. And from your perspective, thankfully, we now have modern science and rational thinking to bring us forward. And I don't view it that way. I'm very comfortable with the Torah and the Talmud the way it is. And that's how I tried to lead my life, to those values and those cores. Are there challenges to that from some of the things, from the very things you're mentioning? Absolutely, tremendously hard and difficult challenges. The only point I want to make, and I'll just take another 30 seconds, is to say that I believe what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs was saying is absolutely true and fundamental, in the sense that you cannot understand an Orthodox Jewish approach to a Jewish understanding of Judaism without taking into account the idea of the written law and the oral law. And that is why both of those things are studied today in all of the Orthodox synagogues and Orthodox yeshivot and academies. Those are the things that are studied. I personally, when I studied for the rabbinate for 3 years of intensive study, those were the kinds of things I was studying: the written law and the books of the Torah and the scripture, and the Mishnah and the Talmud and Jewish law as well, thrown in there for good measure, the books of Jewish law, and continue to study those things. But I do want to say one thing about your question. There are things in the oral law that do soften or really change things in the written law, so that would meet the need that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs was talking about. For example, simple example, everyone knows the famous verse, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And when you read that in the Torah itself, it looks like if I knock out a person's eye, then the court should knock out my eye. If I knock out a person's tooth, they should knock out my tooth. That's what it says. That's a literal reading of the text. However, the Talmud says that is not what was intended. What was intended is that you should pay financial compensation for the other person's limb. So if I strike a person and damage his sight, ruin his sight in one of his eyes, I have to pay financial compensation for that, as opposed to having my eye poked out by the Jewish court. I think we can all agree that that's a more elevated and a more appropriate punishment for a Jewish court to say you're going to have to pay for the damage you did, as opposed to cutting off taking out the person's eye or removing a person's tooth or something like that. However, there are many things that the oral law does not change in that sense. For example, you mentioned examples of capital punishment. Capital punishment was on the books even in the oral law. However, it had to be done through witnesses and through a process that made it very unlikely, very hard to ever actually carry out in practice, as we've talked about before in a previous session. So I think that it's a complicated subject. It's not the subject that one can just, answer in 30 seconds or a couple of minutes. But I do think his basic point was that I do think that's what he was trying to convey. It seems to me, based on how you related.
No, that's exactly what he conveyed. But to me, it's not complicated at all. It's just very clear that it wasn't written by an infallible being. Because if it was an infallible being, he would have put those things in. By the way, when you shouldn't be executing people left and right, and you shouldn't be doing these things. If there's a clarification about an eye for an eye, that should have been written into the Torah. I mean, how much extra ink would it take? Oh, by the way, I don't mean it literally. It's just monetary compensation. An infallible being would have recognized that. And these methods of softening the Torah, I agree with you, Rabbi Kahn, but that was done because of human evolution. That was done because Jews evolved, not because God changed. It was the concept, our concept of God changed as we became more civilized, and therefore the Talmud had to be created to soften it. But they couldn't in the Talmud say, oh, by the way, God made a mistake, because that would have meant that God didn't write the Torah. So they have a fiction, God wrote the Torah, but he also said this oral stuff, which kind of got passed around, and then now we're going to write it down in order to make it seem or to justify what the Torah said. But the simpler explanation, the explanation that makes more sense is just that humans wrote it, they became more mature, and then they decided to try to soften it. Now, if you use Occam's razor to come up with a simple explanation, that's a much simpler explanation than that God wrote it, whispered something to Moses, Moses whispered to Joshua, he then went through the generations, and then eventually it got written down in a bunch of different forms. To me, it's not the way that an all-knowing being would write things down. But I was interested when he said that it's heresy to take the Torah literally. I think you would agree that they believe that traditional Orthodox Jews take the Torah literally, but they read it in tandem with the oral law, and then they put it together, and then it makes something that comes out a little more palatable. Not that you don't take it literally.
I think it seems to me he maybe made that statement as a provocative statement. I don't think it doesn't make sense to say heresy in the sense that you would normally understand heresy. But what he was saying is Orthodox Jews don't just take the Torah and say, just read it and that tells you what you're supposed to do. They take the Torah, they combine it, as you said, in tandem with the rabbinic or with the oral law and the rabbinic traditions. And then they say, now we can figure out how we're supposed to actually act. So I think that's what, it seems to me that's what he was trying to say.
One other thing, and then I'll open it up to other people that want to get in. When he said that we don't take the Torah literally if it's contradicted by a scientific fact. Well, until the time of evolution by Darwin in the 19th century, Adam and Eve wasn't contradicted by a scientific fact. There was no knowledge of evolution. So all of those things would have been taken literally. And then in 1869 or so, all of a sudden, okay, that's not taken literally anymore. It seems like a very elusive standard because science is always discovering more things. And also, how do you determine what's inconsistent with a scientific fact? To me, I would say the story of Noah's Ark is completely inconsistent. But there are Orthodox Jews who say, oh, no, it's not inconsistent at all. And they find weird ways of explaining it. So this is a very elusive standard to put forward. I'm interested in, does anybody else have anything they'd like to share or ask on this topic? Because it's a fascinating topic. That's really, it's the major point of separation, I think, between Orthodox and other denominations of Judaism.
I think Gloria's hand is raised. Gloria, can you unmute yourself?
I want to switch a little, Rabbi Silver, if you don't mind.
Go right ahead.
Rabbi Kahn, you are amazing. And I have another question for you if you don't feel beat up yet.
I never feel beat up. I always feel really, I actually feel energized.
You're amazing, and I think you're wonderful. My question is, how do you feel about the Orthodox Jews in New York that are bucking Cuomo and not wearing masks and saying, you can't tell me not to attend services? That is really annoying me. And I'm wondering how you feel about it.
I feel deeply ashamed. But can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, but you're frozen though.
Yeah, my picture is frozen, but that's okay. My picture is not important. I feel profoundly and deeply ashamed whenever Orthodox Jews do something that hurts other people.
Uh-oh.
Scam or cheating in business, something like that, or in this case where you're talking about the health of people and they're refusing to wear a mask and they're coming together in big ceremonies. I just read about a wedding in New York with I said there were thousands of people coming together in close quarter. I'm ashamed. I'm deeply ashamed. I'm deeply troubled. You know, if I had the ability, or if I was in any kind of position to prevent something like that, or if people would listen to me, which they don't, if I had any kind of authority, I would do anything I possibly could to get that. Now, I will tell you that there are many, many, many Orthodox institutions, synagogues, schools, Orthodox leaders that are who are in a position of power and authority, who are doing everything they can to promulgate, wear masks, don't have big ceremonies, only if you're going to get together to pray, have it be outside in a tent and only 10 people, and doing everything they possibly can. But unfortunately, there are people who are completely flouting and ignoring these very basic precautions, and it's so deeply disturbing. And to my mind, it's not only disturbing, it's suicidal. I mean,
Thank you. I look at them as a mob. I feel like they're a mob.
How are they going to not get the virus themselves? I mean, so many people are dying. So many people are becoming ill. It completely boggles my mind.
Well, it's also contrary to Jewish law, because in Jewish law, protecting human life comes first.
Absolutely.
And you shouldn't even fast on Yom Kippur if it would endanger your health.
Correct.
So it's
yes.
a flouting of Jewish law, unless these people have bought into Trump's delusional world so much that they're going to say that it's not really dangerous, the whole thing's a hoax, or that God's going to protect us. So either they believe that it's a hoax or God's going to protect them, or they're violating Jewish law. And I believe it's the former. I think they must know, if they're Orthodox, this is basic Orthodox Judaism, that protecting your health comes before your religious obligations. That's Orthodox Judaism 101. So I have to believe they must think that it's a hoax, or that God's going to be protecting them, or that their religious obligations are more important. But I'm not sure which one it is, but it is disturbing. And by the way, Rabbi Kahn, we pay a lot of attention to what you say, and we have a lot of respect for your opinion. And if they were going to take a vote on who should be the chief rabbi among all the Orthodox Jews, you would be my first choice right off the bat. So we do listen to what you're saying.
I appreciate that so much, but I'm not even on the list, but of candidates. But I do appreciate.
Well, you're
that.
on our list.
You're
Who else?
wonderful.
Harris, you have a comment?
I just have a comment for Emily. And my comment is, Israel is surrounded by 500 million Muslims. And the number one priority for Jews should be Israel, number one. Every else things come second. That's the way I feel. And I'm sure everybody here feels the same way.
No, I don't. I think I am certainly pro-Israel, but I'm pro-human race. My number one priority right now is to get the human race healthy. My second priority is to get the land so that we won't be ruining this earth. And the political and religious strifes that are going on kind of pale when you think that the human race could disappear because of this virus, that the earth itself could be destroyed by our lack of conserving it. I tend to think on that level. I'm not anti-Israel. I'm just pro-human race.
I think Hillel had the resolution for both of your points of view, where he said that if I am not for myself, who will be? And if I'm for myself alone, what am I? And if not now, when? So I understand Harris's point of view, and I know there's many Jewish people who share it, that the Jewish people are very small in number, and there's nobody else really looking out for us. And so if we just are very diffuse and looking out for all these different issues, 100 different issues, and Israel's 1 out of 100, and everybody else is out to get Israel, there's no more Israel. So I understand the imperative of wanting to protect Israel, but I don't see it as a zero-sum game at all. I don't see, like, if I try to protect Israel, that means there's less time that I have to protect other things. I don't see one or the other. And protecting Israel is protecting America. Protecting Israel is protecting democracy. And Israel, I believe, is the place where the cures for the coronavirus came out of. It's the place where the solution to climate change is coming out of. It's the place where help and assistance to people in Africa and the third world is coming out of. It's a bastion of democracy in the Middle East. So I think protecting Israel is protecting humanity and protecting the planet. And I see no contradiction between the two. Anybody else want to share some thoughts about any topic?
Including, that's
Raylene.
your parents, right? Rabbi Khan, your parents are with us
That-
tonight?
That's my dad in the picture. Dad, why don't you wave? Dad, can you hear me? I'm not sure he's, Dad, go ahead.
Paul? He's not muted, but he sounds like he's muted.
Yeah.
Saul, you want to share any thoughts with us?
Sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Do you want to share any thoughts with us? Do you agree with me that your son is a brilliant rabbi who's a pleasure to listen to? Or do you take issue with that?
He's a brilliant rabbi. He takes after his father.
I missed,
Well done. Well said.
I missed it. I was too laughing. What did he say?
He said he's a brilliant rabbi who takes after his father.
Oh, good. That makes sense.
Very good. Anybody else?
Oh, Valerie, go ahead.
Well, hello, everybody. Sorry I came in a little late. I was working late. Just by the topic of the conversation that's been going on, I can understand why there's so much confusion among the Jewish people themselves, let alone people looking in from the outside. The more questions you ask, the more questions you have.
Uh-oh.
As far as the Torah, as far as the Talmud, as far as the morality, as far as education. I mean, to me, it's so confusing that I don't know sometimes which way to turn, or who to believe at this point. All I do know is that I can't wrap my head around there being one omnipotent entity creating all of this. I believe that, I believe in spirituality, and there is a source called natural nature, natural evolution, natural occurrences that just coincidentally, organized chaos is a perfect term for what I believe has been happening. And to try to put that into some type of cohesive term is very, very confusing and virtually, in my opinion, almost impossible.
Well, I'd like you to do a thought experiment with me. If you were
I have too
accepting,
many thoughts at this time of the day.
if you accepted on faith without any evidence that 2 and 2 is 5, and that was an unshakable belief, and nobody could get you to disbelieve it because you were raised that way and it's part of your tradition, all of mathematics would seem very confusing and hard to understand. Some of it would make sense. 4 and 4 would still be 8, and 10 and 10 would be 20. But if 2 and 2 is 5, a whole bunch of things would be very, very confusing. So in my opinion, if you start out with a premise that God wrote the Torah, which is clearly not based on evidence or science or logic, and then you try to make sense of the world with the view of God presented in the Torah, it's all very, very confusing. But once you just accept something very simple, no, human beings wrote the Torah, which seems very logical and is consistent with evidence, nothing's confusing anymore. There's absolutely no more confusion. Anything in the Torah doesn't make sense. That's because it was written by people in the Bronze Age, and we've learned something from that since then. So that's why there's no confusion at all. Why do bad things happen to good people is extremely confusing if you accept that there's a good God and he's rewarding and punishing or watching out. But if you don't accept that premise, there's nothing confusing at all. Everything just makes sense. So that's why I think we Jews of the future need to come up with a concept of God and Judaism that makes sense and is rational, because otherwise people are going to turn away from it and they're not going to be able to have any sense of faith. You can't have faith in something that you're confused about or that doesn't make any rational sense. You can have faith in ideals of Judaism, like that kindness is a good thing, or that compassion or peace or intelligence or truth. These are good. You can have faith in those ideals because there's no inconsistency. But to have faith in the God of the Torah, who does so many things that don't square with divine knowledge and wisdom and goodness, then it becomes confusing. Gloria,
I'm
go ahead.
confused even more.
Valerie, you
Yes.
remind me of the old Jewish saying, you ask a Jew a question, they won't answer. They're just going to answer with a question for you. So we're all loaded with questions and no answers. So whenever that'll happen, whatever your question is, we all have questions. But that's very typical Jewish, to be
Right.
confused.
Well, I think I provided some very clear answers, and I think science and reason provides all the answers that we need. We don't know everything through science, but it's a method of figuring things out based on evidence that seems to work. So
But
I
it
think we
depends
do
on
have
the
lots of
question.
answers. We have a lot of answers, especially if we apply our rational mind and science and Jewish ideals. And if we combine those together, we have answers. And I believe they provide the answers to how to make this world a better place. Anybody else, or you want to wrap it up? I think we've had a good conversation. Harris, go ahead.
I made a statement earlier about the scientists in Iran that got murdered.
All right.
I thought it was a terrorist attack, and those things
Okay.
shouldn't happen.
You don't agree with that?
No.
Well, let's say hypothetically that this guy was about to provide nuclear weapons to Iran. And if he wasn't assassinated, in 3 years, Iran would have a nuclear weapon, which they've threatened to use and promised to use on Israel. And they could also export that weapon to other Arab nations. Let's just take that as a premise. Do you still think it would have been wrong to assassinate him?
I just think it's a terrorist attack to go in somebody's country and kill the top scientist. That's my feeling.
Well, dropping a nuclear bomb on Israel is a terrorist attack also. So would you think that it would be worth it to kill one person to save all of Israel? Or would you just say, no, we shouldn't do it?
Well, we don't know the facts.
Well, right, I gave you a hypothetical.
We don't know if that's going to happen.
No, we don't know, but the problem is that when people have told the Jewish people that we're going to destroy you and wipe you out, one thing that we learned from history is believe them. Don't just say, well, we don't really know if it's going to happen or not. Maybe they're bluffing or maybe they can't do it. If someone threatens to destroy Israel or to wipe out Jews, I say fight them and attack them. Don't wait around and see if it's going to happen or not, especially if they're very close to acquiring nuclear weapons and they have a guy who's able to make that happen. I, for one, think that they should have taken him out. And I think that they also should have taken out the nuclear reactor in Iraq and in Syria. Israel went in, and I guess you might call this a terrorist attack. But Israel invaded Iraq and Syrian airspace and took out the reactors.
Right.
And I think they did a blessing for the world and for Israel. And I don't know if you want to call that a terrorist attack or not. I call it self-defense. I think it's justified. And I think that Iran is so reprehensible and so reckless, saying that they're going to destroy Israel. If you say that, then you're going to have to pay a price. You better be prepared to pay a price. And I'm glad to see that Israel has the ability and the brains and the guts to go ahead and take someone out who's making threats against Israel like that and threatening to destroy them with a nuclear bomb. I have no problem with it.
It was a little embarrassing for Iran that happened.
That's true. That's true.
Right.
That's why they might have to
Right.
save face and counterattack.
If it's
Anyway, I
gonna
think
save
it's been a great discussion. Go ahead, Harris.
If it's going to save Israel in the future, I'm with you.
All right, good. I made a convert. Anyway, it's been a great discussion, everybody. Rabbi Kahn, want to thank you once again for a wonderful discussion of the Torah and current events. And,
Always a pleasure.
Judaism. I want to thank everybody else for joining us. This will be on tape. And Saul, I want to thank you. It's wonderful to see you and to see the fruits of your parenting upon Rabbi Kahn. I think on the next time I'm going to ask for your secrets on how do you produce such a fine
Absolutely.
young man. All right.
I just wanted to tell everybody that we have another brand new discussion tomorrow night. It'll be the first time that we'll be doing this on Zoom. It'll be Rabbi Silver and Mike Essen, who is a radio show host. And it should be a pretty interesting discussion about Israel and Obama. And I welcome you to come on to that at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. The link was in the voice today, and it should be on the website as well. Suzanne, can you confirm that, please?
I'm sure it is.
Thanks,
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Sharon, for organizing that too. This is going to be called Friendly Fire. It's like Crossfire, but it's going to be friendly. I'm going to cross swords with Mike Essen, a radio talk show host, a Republican right-wing Jew who has views very different than me, although on some issues are the same. And before we disband, I just want to say this. I don't know about you, but I am thrilled that Scott Atlas resigned and is no longer involved or in charge of our response to the coronavirus. Because I'm glad that Atlas resigned, because when people have been dying by the hundreds of thousands, Atlas shrugged. So I think this is a very good thing. And I think that hopefully in the future, we'll have somebody who's actually responsible and who knows something about infectious diseases. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Pleasure to be with
night.
you. I'll see you maybe tomorrow.